I'm Rob Tannen, Director of Research and Interface Design at Bresslergroup. Bresslergroup is a 40-year-old product design and development firm. And over the years, Bresslergroup has developed capabilities in a range of different areas as product design has evolved. And one of the key areas that we've been focusing on in recent years is the integration of interface design with product design, or as we call it, integrated UI and ID. There's a few different aspects of that that are important to consider. One of those is having the right skills or team members in order to have both the interface and the industrial design covered. But just as important is to have a process that pulls in the strengths and capabilities from both sides of the design world. One of the ways in which we're trying to explore and refine a human interaction design process is through community involvement. And recently we worked with PhillyChi, which is a Philadelphia-based human-computer interaction group, to host and facilitate an event around solving problems and addressing designs in multiple channels. And so what we had, what took place during the event were breaking up the group into multiple design teams made up of industrial and interface designers, and giving them what seemed to be a relatively simple design challenge. It was to design an interface for a flyable toy based on air hog products, which are basically toy helicopters you can fly around, in this case with an integrated camera. And the task was essentially to come up with the flight and camera remote controls, which in itself seems straightforward, and adapt those, though, to various modalities. So, for example, to have a physical, like a joystick type of controller for controlling the helicopter, vocal or voice controls for controlling the device, a touch interface for controlling the device, and a gestural interface for controlling the device. So the idea being not that each of these interfaces would be control separate parts, but that any one of them, for example, gestural or touchscreen, could control all the aspects, or in fact that they could be mixed and matched as preferable. One of the key trends we found is that designers tend to be biased in the modality that they're most familiar with, which is not a surprise. So for example, if you're an interface designer, it's likely you're going to start with that as your baseline and then adapt the other forms or other modalities off of that. And that certainly makes sense as a first place to start, but it introduces some interesting conflicts or potential problems. One of those being, of course, that digital interfaces are extremely malleable and flexible and easy to change, and you can do some very complex behaviors on a screen that don't necessarily translate well when you have to adapt them to gestural or voice or physical controls. The other side of the coin is if you're starting with a physical interface and you have the space and material and potentially cost limitations there, that might constrain how you adapt your interface design. Many of the solutions involve wearable adaptations, such as something you put on your hands or something you put on over your eyes as a way to both display and control the device remotely. One of the other observations around the different processes that the groups used was whether or not they acted as a cohesive design team or subdivided. Now, part of this was driven, of course, by the relatively quick time frame they had to come up with solutions. But we saw in some groups an early on plan to break up the task into different channels. So certain people within a group would work on the digital interface, certain people would work on the physical interface, and so on. And then they'd sort of come together at the end. And that kind of represents what we consider to be the traditional process that a lot of companies follow now, which is not integrated. They'll have teams designing the interface and teams designing the product, and they're missing the opportunity to optimize both by designing them together, and often don't take into consideration whether certain features or controls or interactions should reside in one domain or the other. Other groups took a more cohesive approach where they would, as a team, brainstorm and try to allocate functions to different modalities and then use that to build up their different design. At the end of the day, there are really two key issues that need further investigation. One of them being, what process do you use? And that really depends to a certain extent on the complexity of the object or the system you're designing. If you're designing something that's got a relatively simple or basic interface, then you might be able to get away with the more traditional split-up approach, where the interface kind of gets added on at the end. It's not ideal, but it's probably workable. However, as we get products with more complex interfaces, or at least more rich or data-intensive interfaces, then it makes more sense to start out with a information-driven approach where the interactions and data that the user is going to be interacting with should be driving the initial design direction. The second key question, which I alluded to earlier, was how do you decide when to provide multiple ways of interacting with a product or system, and if so, what are those modalities, and then what functions do you allow in each modality? In other words, if you think about something like driving, where you want your visual attention on the road and you want your hands on the steering wheel, then voice certainly makes sense. But do you try to solve everything by voice, or just certain functions? And so I think there's going to be some emerging guidelines as well as research questions related to developing interfaces that people can interact with in multiple ways, and also whether or not that's something that's provided kind of by default to give everyone the option, or probably more likely something that designers decide based on our expertise and our input, so that we give people the best experience based on each modality.